Hi, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Headlines with the Times of Israel. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, the Jewish World and Archaeology editor here. And this week, the Jewish world is commemorating Tisha B'Av. So we're here with archaeologist Dr. Joe Uziel, who's the new head of the Israel Antiquities Authority's Dead Sea Scroll Lab, but has been for many years excavating ancient Jerusalem and the city of David. So, Joe, first of all, what is Tisha B'Av all about?
Well, Tisha B'Av is a fast day, which is also noted in the biblical text, and it is commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem, primarily in the First Temple period, although later attributions also put it for the destruction of the Second Temple. And basically, it's been around for many years. And we know that historically Jerusalem has two very major destructions in its history. The first is by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. They actually succeed in doing what others had tried previously, including likely the Arameans as well as the Assyrians, but they didn't manage to destroy the city, probably due to some of the finds that we'll be speaking about shortly, and the preparations that Jerusalem did in prior to these attacks. But in 586 BC, the Babylonians do destroy Jerusalem, and for a period of 70 years, Jerusalem lay roughly waste, even though we do have some evidence of some activity. And then some 70 years later, the people are allowed to return to Zion under the Persian Empire and begin to rebuild the walls. These are events described in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and which we have little archaeological evidence for, but there are some remains from that period discovered in the various areas of excavation. And slowly that ends up growing until Jerusalem reaches its peak in the late Second Temple period, roughly some 2,000 years ago, beginning with the time of Herod in the 1st century BC, and continuing into the period of what we call the rule of the Roman procurators, which are Roman governors sent to Jerusalem to rule over the city. Eventually, this leads to a first rebellion by the Jews in 66 CE or AD, depending on which term you want to use. And that rebellion lasts for 4 years, and then Jerusalem is destroyed once again. And so typically, Tisha B'Av is the day commemorating these destructions.
Okay, so let's talk about the first destruction in 586 BCE. I mean, to me, Jerusalem kind of seems like a character out of a Marvel Universe movie. It's always in peril, always about on the brink of utter destruction and dismay. But in 586 BC, we actually do see that the city was destroyed. And what do we actually physically see? What have archaeologists uncovered?
Well, first of all, the 586 BC destruction is actually quite different from the 70 CE destruction in terms of what we see. It's not that everywhere that we excavate, we find these huge destruction levels, these huge burnings, these huge stone collapses with vessels and so on and so forth. What we typically find at archaeological sites where we're excavating destruction. And in fact, you mentioned that Jerusalem is always in peril, but that's actually not so much the case. Up until 586, Jerusalem's actually quite stable. And although we do have the biblical narrative, which speaks of, the conquests, obviously the most famous being David's conquest of the city, we don't have material evidence for this. If we go to parallel sites of the same period, we get destruction layer upon destruction layer upon destruction layer, and it's really nice. I mean, it's sad to say that archaeologists love destruction, but we do. And basically, you peel away each layer of destruction, you get to the earlier one. One of I'd say the key sites for this would be Lachish, which is the second most important site in Judah. And what we know of Lachish is that roughly in the period of the First Temple, every 100 years or so, the site is destroyed with a destruction level. It begins in the 9th century. It goes on to the 8th century destruction by Sennacherib. in 701 BC, and then it can once again in 586 BC. And Jerusalem is not that way. Jerusalem actually is stable, likely because of the choice of where they placed the site, which was actually a very, very narrow hill in its first stages, but one that's very defendable with two very deep valleys on either side enclosing it, and water source which would allow them to withstand a siege of the city, because they had permanent water supply. And one of the main things in ancient cities is actually protecting your water supply. And one of the things that we've discovered in Jerusalem, if we go to our first slide, we can see the tower, a tower that was built surrounding this water source and protecting it. Now, the stones used to build this tower are enormous. They're very, very large, rough boulders, some of them even 2 meters wide, 2 meters tall. Imagining how they moved them, how they put them into place is incredible. And basically the walls are up to about 7 meters thick. They stand till today to a height of 7 meters. And these were built, well, there's an argument here, because some have attributed them in the past to what we call the Middle Bronze Age or the Canaanite period. Our C14 tests conducted roughly where you see that black and white stick actually yielded dates of the 9th century BCE. And we actually offer up two explanations. One, which is that it was originally built during the Canaanite period and then repaired some almost 900,000 years later in the 9th century BCE, when Jerusalem is flourishing again under the Judean monarchy. And the second, which is a little bit more controversial, but I seem to be going more and more in that direction, is that it was actually originally constructed in this period. Now, this tower basically protects the water source from all directions, and it's just one of the many elements that manipulate and protect the water. The most famous, of course, being the Siloam Tunnel, often attributed to Hezekiah prior to the arrival of that same Sennacherib that we mentioned, who leads the Assyrian armies to destroy Lachish in 701 BCE, arrives in Jerusalem, and for whatever reason, doesn't conquer it. Of course, there's the biblical descriptions which attested to a major plague which hits the Assyrian army and so forth. And Sennacherib himself, who claims that he put Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And basically, the bottom line is, for whatever reason, the Assyrian army does an about-face and doesn't destroy Jerusalem. Now, if you understand the ancient world, you understand that marching a long distance and coming to Jerusalem and not conquering it was not really Sennacherib's aim. And so obviously these preparations, the tower, which was earlier on but surrounded the spring, the tunnel which took the water from the spring and let it into a large pool, allowed Jerusalem to withstand these events, and actually led to Jerusalem's rise of importance even furthermore, because still we're talking prior to 586 and prior to Tisha B'Av, but during that time when the other sites in Judah had been destroyed, and some of these were pretty important sites. Lachish was a very, very important site in Judah, but there were many, many others. It leads to a rise in the importance of the sites in the hill country, and specifically Jerusalem. And one of the things, for example, that we see is a very, very, very developed bureaucratic system, which develops in Jerusalem. And one of the best signs of this are these great little pieces of clay. They're like they're this big, and they're stamped. Now, this begins earlier on, but in its early stages, these just show all kinds of symbols. And these pieces of clay were used in a similar manner that you would imagine using wax. I always imagine the Lady Mary, and I always use this example, when she's rolling up her letter to send to Robin Hood, and she pours the wax on the letter, and then she stamps it to make sure it's sealed and stays sealed until it arrives to its destination. And this was a common practice in trade in the ancient world, whether sending commodities in a container, which would have been sealed with a similar type of seal, or sending letters. And in the 8th century, in the late 8th century, and 7 centuries BCE, we see that Judah is dynamic, and it's sending documents, and these officials who are writing the documents or who are in charge with sealing them are putting their seals, and some of them are actually quite complete. You can see in this slide, you can see one of these bulle, and this one's a very interesting one. I like it. Together with Ortal Khalif, who was my partner in the excavation, and Anat Mendel, we wrote up an article about the bulle that we found on the eastern slopes. And you can see here in ancient Hebrew writing, it says le'achiav, to Achiav, ben, the son of Menachem. Now, first of all, these are just two of many, many names. We have a whole slew of names appearing on these bulle. Some of them are officials. A few of them are even officials that we know from the biblical text. Sometimes the names are not specifically known from the biblical text, but they're, the construction of the name, the form of the name indicates to us that we're talking about Judahites, okay, people living in the Judean kingdom in the First Temple period. For example, these names often end with Yud He Vav, Yahu, which is the typical ending of names in Judah, okay? Judah is in essence Yehuda, which is the same Yud He Vav. These names don't have it, and in fact, we carefully suggest here that the names we have here are actually names of Israelite kings. So it's not that we're talking about a seal of Israelite kings, but we're talking about a person that named his son, and then his son named his grandson by using names from the Israelite kingdom. And perhaps this is another indication, because although we speak a lot about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, some 140 years earlier, the kingdom of Israel was destroyed in the north. And archaeologists love to argue, and we're constantly debating things. And one of the debates is how many people from Israel actually arrived in Jerusalem. And I admit I'm one of the minimalists. I don't think that it was huge amounts of people, although some have suggested that it was thousands. I think it was a much more modest number. But there definitely are bits and pieces of evidence showing that some Israelites did arrive in Judah and Jerusalem, and some of them even found their way into this administrative system. But I've been going on and on about the pre-Tisha B'Av days. Well, what happens in 586 BC? In 586 BC,
before you go on, just a few questions about the many, many, many fascinating things you already mentioned to us. For one thing, it's my impression that on the seals, when it says le Achiav, it's actually belonging to Achiav. Is it not? It's not like we're sending a letter to Achiav necessarily. It's more that this piece of whatever the seal was on belonged to this king. Is that not correct?
Well, it's the official stamping it, and it's belonging to the stamp is belonging to that official, meaning that you're right, if that wasn't clear. He's not the one on the receiving end, he's the one on the sending end. Yes.
And another thing, just because the title of these conversations is Behind the Headlines. So recently in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Arnona, a whole bunch of these seals and other seals like it were discovered. How does this correspond to what you have seen in terms of the administrative processes in the city of David? I'm assuming that this seal was uncovered in the city of David, the seal you were talking about?
Yes, the seal that we showed before was a group of many seals which are about to be published in a scientific article, and they were found along the eastern slopes of the city of David, so in ancient Jerusalem. The site that you mentioned, Arnona, is located to the south of the city of David. And there what you have is a little bit different. You don't have the bulle, you don't have the stamps. What you have are stamps on jars. And this is basically part of the same, another segment actually of the administrative systems of collecting taxes and trade and so on and so forth. And those have usually several types of things on them. So you have ones that are inscribed with the words lemelech. Again, and here you have the debate, is this belonging to the king or is this being sent to the king? And then underneath it, one of 4 city names, Hebron, Ziph, Mamshat, and Socho. And so it's obviously some kind of taxation system in play right around the time of the Assyrian Empire's march to Jerusalem, although it continues beyond this. And we have these in the city of David as well. Another set of these stamps that they discovered in Arnona, which we also have in Jerusalem, although I must say that Arnona's finds are outstanding, very, very big surprise, is seals on jars mentioning specific names, probably also of important officials involved in this taxation system. And they were putting their stamps on jars as part of the system of moving commodities from place to place. So those are a little bit different than our boule, because our boule we can more attribute, first of all, to actual letters, and sometimes you can actually see the markings on the back of the boule. Okay, we're always taking a look at the front because the front has the name on it. But if you turn them around, you can also usually see the negative of the papyrus, which it was put onto, and the string which had been tied to hold the papyrus as a scroll. And so they're a little bit different, but they're all part of this incredible administrative system that is revealed to us in archaeological excavations in Judah and Jerusalem.
Let's get back to our damsel in distress, Jerusalem, who's about to be destroyed.
Right. So 586 BC, Jerusalem isn't as lucky as it was in 701 BC. The Babylonian armies are more prepared. And basically, what we find is, I'd say, locales or specific points where we can very, very clearly see destruction. For example, the room that you're looking at here, which you can see the stones that had collapsed onto this storage room. And we know it's a storage room because all of the finds in a very, very small room, about 1 meter wide and about 2 meters long, we found about 12 jars that were standing in this room. So it was obviously some kind of storage room, which in 586, the ceiling or roof of this room burnt, collapsed, and you can see all that black overlying the pottery there, and then the stones collapsing from the walls inward. So this is one of the great cases where we find very, very clear evidence of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Now, people may be wondering, how can you date it so perfectly well? In this case, in this specific case, it's a correlation, first of all, between the historical record, which we know Jerusalem is destroyed in 586 BC, and the archaeological finds. We are more and more moving towards using high-tech finds, I'll call them, or what I'll call archaeological sciences. And we're using, for example, C14 on a large scale now, together with the Weizmann Institute, in the field, collecting dates of every single context. Our problem with the First Temple period, or the latter part of the First Temple period, is that we fall on a spot where the C14 results are difficult to interpret. And so for now, at least, C14 hasn't been the key in dating the 586 BC destruction. What has been the key are these jars, because specifically, if I speak about these jars, and we spoke about the finds at Arnona, what happens after our stamped jar handles with the lamelech is that they're replaced, and they're replaced by a different symbol, the symbol of a small flower known as a rosette. And those rosettes are typical of the 586 BC destruction in Judah. We don't find them elsewhere. We find them in typical layers dating to the end of the Iron Age. And in this room, several of the jars that we've restored have been found to have these stamps on them. And so were very, very clearly set. But one of the interesting things,
where did you find this room exactly?
this room is on the eastern slopes of the city of David. Just as a backdrop, the city of David, again, this long and narrow hill, eventually, and we'll talk about it a little later when we get into the later periods, the site sort of shifts away from the eastern slopes. The reason that the eastern slopes are so important in the early periods is because our spring is down there. But then we have the Siloam Tunnel, which moves the water, and then you have later technologies introduced like aqueducts, which can move water from springs farther away. And so the reliance on the spring is less intense, and it's not at all intense in the area of the eastern slopes. And so later periods, there's no settlement along the eastern slopes. You have settlement on the summit of the city of David. You have settlement on the western hill, on the area of the Jewish quarter, and so on and so forth. And so there, what you have is remains of later periods, which are cutting into and removing some of the earlier remains. The eastern slopes were basically a garbage dump after the 586 destruction. And so they're the perfect place to go and to speak and to uncover and learn about First Temple period Jerusalem, because basically that is the first layer that you're going to get to.
So one man's trash is another man's treasure, and you have published several things about the trash dumps in the city of David. But in terms of the destruction, how is this trash helping you?
Well, the trash just covers everything over and has left it, uncovered, covered over and undisturbed. And so when we remove the trash layers, we get straight down into these buildings, which were built some 2,600, 2,700 years ago and met their demise in 586 BCE. One of the most interesting things that we're discovering right now is that when we take a look across a broad level of Jerusalem, we have these nodes of destruction, but then we have the next room over, which doesn't show signs of destruction. And what we're trying to do is a joint project here between the Israel Antiquities Authority, along with our partners at Tel Aviv University, who are also digging in the city of David on the other side, on the western slopes, is to try and understand why we see destruction in certain areas and why we don't see destruction in other areas. And could this be something that microarchaeology solves for us? For example, is it destruction that we just don't see, or is it really just destroying specific spots? Is it an issue of what was in the room that caused the destruction? In other words, you have the Babylonian army running through the city, and if there is, jars of olive oil, for example, and one of them threw in his torch into that room, then it would go up in flames or grain. But if there was nothing in the room, then it wouldn't burn, the torch would burn out, and that would be the end of it. So this is something that we're starting to try and develop using, again, these advanced sciences and these tools that are able to tell us a little bit further and deeper into the story.
So one of the more recent articles about the Givati parking lot section of the city of David, the archaeology excavation, was talking about how after the destruction, people came back to Zion and started kind of having these squatter camps, it seemed like, where they didn't necessarily reuse the houses that were destroyed, but right next to it in the courtyard or other places really in the vicinity, they would basically start afresh in some kind of very low burn resettlement activity. Did you see any of that yourself?
So that's the interesting thing about the development of the city of David, because as opposed to the eastern slopes, where mostly my excavations are, on the western slopes in the Givati parking lot, we see this renewal of activity very, very soon after. And it seems like it's really just people who more or less left the city, survived the Babylonian destruction, but were not exiled into, to Babylon, to the new city of Judah, which is in Babylon, and they remained in the area. And they very quickly come back and they have to find where to settle. And like you said, they're not clear. It's not a huge workforce. It's not many people. They're just aiming to find a place to, settle down and restart their lives. And they sort of, with this squatter activity, locate the easiest areas to settle without having to clear out major destructions and sort of build up their small walls within the courtyard and so on. And the reason that it develops along the western slope is because the entire shift of the city has already occurred when the water was moved. And so there's no reason to go back down to the eastern slopes. You might as well stick around on the western slopes where you have the valley leading straight down to the Siloam pool, which would have still been fed by the Siloam tunnel. And then eventually, when the temple is built, you have that same pathway, that same valley, which connects between the pool and the temple. And that actually is the basis of the development of the city in the Second Temple period until it reaches its peak. And then what we see running roughly across this valley is this monstrous, magnificent street, which is built connecting the Siloam pool and the Temple Mount. And if we take a look at our next slide, thank you, you can see the remains of our excavations along this street. Now, this is a street that has to overcome the topographical position of the Temple Mount on a very, very high point and the pool on a very, very low point of the city. And so you see that it's built up with very, very moderate steps so that you can slowly make your climb. Now, this is one of the most magnificent features uncovered in Jerusalem, in my opinion. We're talking about a street that's at its minimum roughly about 8 meters wide and 600 meters in length. Our rough estimations speak about 10,000 tons of stone in order to construct this street. And there are two very, very amazing things about this street. One is that you're using 10,000 tons of stone and major efforts to construct the street, but the street isn't the focal point. It's not the main event. The main event is the Temple Mount, and the second event is the Siloam pool. But the street is the thing that connects the two, and it basically puts us in the mindset of what life was like in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, or what life was like for someone arriving in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago in order to take part in the religious ceremonies. And so if you or I were living in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, we would have entered the city at the southern gate, we would have stopped at the Siloam pool, and then we would have began our procession, which would have been part of the religious ceremony leading up to the Temple Mount. And you can see this today in religious ceremonies, whether it's in Mecca or whether it's in Jerusalem today along the Via Dolorosa. You have the same idea of a procession leading up to the main focal point, which would have been the Temple Mount.
I agree that this picture doesn't do it justice. I was there with your comrade Aryeh Levi last year at some point, and the picture that we just saw is basically half the width of the street. It had to be constructed in this way because there's a neighborhood, a living, breathing neighborhood above it, some 5 meters above the excavation. But in any case, what we're seeing is just half of the width of the street. And as you're going up from the bottom, you're just filled with this really monumental feeling of the grandiose nature of what you're about to see. Every step you take takes you closer to the Temple Mount. And there would have been shops on both sides. It would have been a very bustling, busy kind of situation. And you're in the state of mind and purity, perhaps going to Siloam pool as a mikveh. I'm not sure if that's correct, and then processing up to the Temple Mount in this broad, paved, monumental street that actually was only used for a couple decades, right?
So that's the second interesting point is we published an article, Nachshon Zanton led this article, where we raised pavers of the street, those big, large stones that you saw, picked them up, moved them aside, and excavated beneath. And what we found were coins. Now, I mentioned C14 dating before, and C14 dating is very, very accurate, but still for certain periods, and particularly for this period of the late Second Temple period, coins are even more exact, because if you take a look and you open up your wallet and you take out the coins, you can see they're often stamped with or minted with dates on them, very specific dates, years. And that's the case that we have here. We lifted the stones and we kept getting back coins, the latest of which are dated to 3031 CE or AD in various sections of this street. And so we came to realize that this street, first of all, could not have been built prior to 3031 CE because the coins are beneath it. And so at best, this street, with all its effort, was in use for less than 40 years. And there are some that narrow it down in date and make it much later even. For example, Roni Reich, who excavated northern parts of this street right beneath the Temple Mount, beneath Robinson's Arch. But we think that it actually does belong to the period of 30, 31, 35, very difficult to know exactly, but roughly that period at a time when Jerusalem was being ruled by Roman procurators, the most famous of which, and the person who we attribute to ruling Jerusalem during the time when this road was, or this street was completed, none other than Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate is, of course, best known or infamously known for the crucifixion. And the historical sources who reflect on Pontius Pilate reflect on him very negatively because of this event. But we also know from Josephus and now from the archaeological record that Pontius Pilate was also governing Jerusalem at a time when many of its major features were being built, like the street that we see, which we've archaeologically shown. And for example, Josephus mentions his construction of the water aqueduct, which we can also attribute to this time. So we see he's also involved in the construction of Jerusalem and not only negative activities, which are often attributed to him.
So there's this mega building going on. In one of your more recent research articles that came out, also talks about dating some of this mega building in Wilson's Arch. Can you talk about the process of this article and what's so new about the technique you're using?
Okay, so we excavated beneath Wilson's Arch. Wilson's Arch is a very large stone arch, which still stands to date. And prior to our excavations, there were huge arguments about when it dates from. Some attributed it all the way back 2,000 years to a period of the Second Temple, when a bridge would have carried people from the Western Hill into the Temple Mount, entering just above Wilson's Arch. Others, relying largely on their interpretation of historical sources, said it couldn't be the original bridge of the Second Temple period, and it has to be a later bridge. So you had opinions dating it to the late Roman period, when Jerusalem is no longer a Jewish city, but is actually a Roman colony by the name of Aelia Capitolina, and others who even attributed it all the way into the Islamic period, saying that with the return to the Temple Mount in the Islamic period and the construction of the Temple Mount as we see it today, the entrance was renewed, and Wilson's Arch, as we see it today, belongs to that period. Now, when we began the excavations in Wilson's Arch, we set our methodology towards integrating C14 dating top down. So every layer, every element that we expose, we were using C14 dating to try and narrow its dating down. But one of the challenges here was that we had these huge monumental structures, the arch itself particularly, which we wanted to narrow down its dating. We had 700 years here. We wanted to get it down to a lot shorter than that. And we didn't have the finds or the archaeological context that we were expecting in order to be able to date it, like surfaces that go with the arch and so on. And so what we had to do is develop a special methodology. And what we did was we went in between the stones and collected mortar from in between the stones. Now, mortar has in it organic materials like seeds, which are mixed in it in order to sort of absorb some of the humidity and wetness and make the mortar stronger. And these seeds were extracted from the mortar, and we were able to date them using C14. And we got back very, very specific results, being able to attribute, first of all, the arch as we see it today to the period of the 1st century CE. So in other words, the late Second Temple period, right around the period that we're talking about this street. And so it's possible that we're looking at, again, the same sort of network of construction that's making Jerusalem this megapolis, this mega city. But we also discovered that there was an earlier bridge that was half the size. So if the Wilson's Arch Bridge is 15 meters wide, the original bridge would have been 7.5 meters wide, and that bridge roughly dates to Herod's rule. But the biggest surprise in Wilson's Arch wasn't the arch, because we knew it was there, and it wasn't the Western Wall, because we knew that was there, but it was this amazing little structure. And if we can bring up the picture of it, you can see here, we skipped something. Oops. Okay.
We'll move on. Yeah.
Okay. So.
Next slide, please, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, so if you take a look, this is a structure that's half a circle, and you can see at its center there are steps going up, and basically from its architectural components, we were able to very, very particularly attribute it to a specific function. This is a Roman public building, which looks like a theater, okay? But if it was a theater, it would be much larger. For example, the theaters that we know in Caesarea or Beit She'an or in other places all over. But this one's very, very small. It was actually built within the confines of the arch. So it's about 15 meters wide and 13 meters long, or the other way around, however you look at wide and long. And basically, it would have held a crowd of, at best, 200 people, which is too small for a theater. But we know in the Roman world of other structures which look like theaters, but they're used for different things. And we suggest that this is either a building known as a bouleuterion, which would have held the city council meetings, or an Odeon. An Odeon is like a theater, but instead of watching Shakespeare on stage, you would be listening to Lenny Kravitz play his acoustical guitar on a stage in front of a small, unplugged MTV crowd. And so that's the type of building that we're looking at. And the amazing thing about this building is, first of all, we know Jerusalem had theaters and theater-like structures and other structures belonging to the Roman world, both in the Second Temple period from historical sources and after its destruction, when Jerusalem again becomes a Roman colony known as Aelia Capitolina. And these are mentioned in historical sources, and archaeologists have been searching for them for 150 years, basically, since we've been excavating in Jerusalem. And I don't think anyone expected us to find this here beneath the arch. The building dates to actually not the Second Temple period. It dates to after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem is developing, and eventually in 130 AD is declared as a Roman colony by Hadrian. The most interesting thing I think about this building is that when we take a look at the very, very close details, what we can see is that the building was never completed. The stairs are not finished. The carvings along the edge are not finished. And so we get this picture of Jerusalem building these buildings 80% of the way, and then it stops. And one of the challenges to understand, because we don't have, the letter left behind by the architect saying, I stopped building because, of this and this and this reason, but to try and understand what could be the reasoning. And of course, there are some mundane reasons that are known from the ancient world and from the Roman world. For example, they ran out of money. We actually have interesting documentation of buildings that were being constructed, and an architectural fault was found by the engineer, and he stops construction. And so these things happen just like they happen in the modern world. They happened in the Roman world. But when we're talking about this specific period, and if we go back to our C14 dating, we know that this building was constructed right along the time of the declaration of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. And what happens as an outcome of Jerusalem being declared as a Roman colony is that the Jews no longer living in Jerusalem, but still hoping to return, as they did after the first destruction, after the destruction of the first temple, and some 70 years later returned. Here, we're 60 years after the destruction of the second temple, and Jews are living in the area of Jerusalem. And I believe, and of course I can't interview them, but I believe that they still had hopes in their heart that they would be allowed and able to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild it. And all of a sudden it's becoming this Roman colony. And so in 132 CE or AD, there's a second rebellion known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And this is not a simple event. And it's possible that what we're looking at here are the exact moments of the outbreak of this event, where the Romans are involved in constructing structures in Jerusalem as part of Aelia Capitolina, and the outbreak of the revolt outside of Jerusalem causes them to leave it all behind and go deal with the revolt. The revolt is not a simple event. It actually lasts for a few years, and in the end, the Romans prevail. But it's possible that when they return, their plans are already a little bit different. Their strength is a little bit dwindled. And so this structure is left behind unfinished. And one of the debates that we have was whether, as an unfinished structure, was it used at all and what it was used for, because it obviously could not have been used for what it was originally intended.
When you unveiled this, what, 2 years ago, about 2 years ago, I have to say that the theater structure is very interesting. And if you tie the intellectual, historical perspective to it, it's obviously compelling. But there is nothing like walking into that subterranean chamber and just seeing 8 more courses of the Western Wall. It's jaw-dropping. And you could see that in the picture. And in this next slide that we added, you can see, Mick, if you can put on the next slide, you can see that there are just these massive monumental stones that people hadn't really seen for, thousands of years almost, until you guys excavated here.
Well, very, very specifically, I'd say about 16 or 1700 years, that these stones, which are the same Western Wall that everyone knows and everyone's, been to, these are the same, this is stones of the same wall. And basically, one of the things that you need to remember is that the area of prayer of the Western Wall is a very, very small section of this very, very long wall, about 250 meters in length, which was one of the walls which held up the podium of the Temple Mount. And these were constructed in the Herodian period, so roughly 2,000 years ago. And you can see how finely built this wall is. And when it isn't exposed to the elements in the open air, how well preserved it is, how the stones are basically as if they were carved almost yesterday, and still just to be discovered by us some 2,000 years or 1,600 years after they had seen their last light.
It was truly one of the highlights of my journalism career. Now, we've been talking for quite a while, so I'd like to just finish with a few minutes about your new role as the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls lab for the Israel Antiquities Authority. Now, you're kind of not the obvious choice in my mind to take over from Penina Shor, who founded the unit and headed it for a long time, decades, because you're not a text person. You're not somebody who comes at it from a textual perspective. Rather, you're, as we've been discussing, a real get dirty kind of archaeologist. So why did they choose you, other than you being a great guy and eminently qualified? But what do you bring to the role?
Well, first of all, I have to say that coming into the role, this was one of the things was that this was a huge challenge for me. I'm not a text person, as you said. I'm an archaeologist. I've been in the field in Jerusalem 10 years running, but I've been in archaeology for about 25 years. And, you know, moving from field archaeology to a totally different world holds a lot of challenge to it. And you mentioned Penina Shor, who established the unit, and she wonderfully mentored me, and she's on my speed dial. I still call her regularly to consult, and she's always happy to help out. But when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and actually I go back to an article that you wrote a couple of years ago, before I knew I was going to get into the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was, I think, for 70 years, it was for 50 years of Jerusalem, I think. And you wrote an article asking people what the most important archaeological find was in Israel. And I think everyone's obvious choice was the Dead Sea Scrolls, because now I can clear the record, and anyone who can read that article can now call me a liar. It is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the most important archaeological find of the 20th century, and hopefully the 21st century will lead to something just as extravagant and amazing. But for now, it's still the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so having the option of possibly being able to contribute to the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls in any way was an amazing, amazing opportunity as far as I was concerned. And I think that, and this is also important to remember, Penina is also an archaeologist. She's just been so involved with the scrolls for the past decade or so, or even more, that people just sort of automatically associate her to the scrolls. But she's an archaeologist at heart, and she worked at the IAA, at the Israel Antiquities Authority, for 40 years. A lot of that was prior to her arrival at the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think that actually having the perspective of an archaeologist, and an archaeologist who's been doing a lot of, I think we've been doing a lot of cutting edge field work in the archaeology of Jerusalem, and bringing up the level of the development of the sciences and so forth, that I think when I come to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I come with that same approach. And Penina had that approach, and she had started a lot of important scientific projects. And what I'm hoping is to really continue building on that, and really continue to integrate what we've been doing in archaeological sciences into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and really take that next step forward. And the most, I think, important challenge for me will be to do that, integrating the sciences, not into necessarily, or into the textual studies and the material studies, but mostly the conservation. Because when I take on this challenge of the Dead Sea Scrolls unit at the Israel Antiquities Authority, and just to put things in proportion, because I think a lot of people know the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they know the 7 scrolls that are displayed in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, and those are very, very important scrolls. But the Israel Antiquities Authority cares for another about 1,000 manuscripts put together by 25,000 fragments. And so we have to make sure that these are preserved and conserved for future generations. And the truth is that when they were originally discovered, this concept, or this mindset of conservation, wasn't as well developed, and a lot of damage was actually done to the scrolls unintentionally by earlier scholars working on them, and even trying to preserve them to a certain extent. And so a lot of what we're involved in is trying to undo that damage. And by integrating scientific research, this is one of, I think, the big challenges, which again, Pnina started, and I'd like to continue.
So anyone who's more interested in hearing about the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls Unit can take a listen to a podcast I did with Pnina Shor. You can find that on anywhere you find podcasts. But one last question for you, Joe. As an archaeologist, do you think it's possible that we could still find more Dead Sea Scrolls in situ, in caves, in archaeological excavations?
There's a 50-50 chance here I'm going to get this wrong or right. To be honest, I do believe that there still may be a chance, but it hasn't happened, and others believe that we found what there is to be found. I want to go back to my theater in Jerusalem for a second, because when we found it, there was exactly that wave of the people who had said, nah, never going to find it. And it had gotten to the point where there were even people who said Jerusalem's theaters must have been built of a wood structure because we haven't found any in 150 years. If I ever thought that we had, exhausted all of our archaeological evidence, then I wouldn't be an archaeologist, I think. And so I always think that we have to keep that hope in our heart that, yes, maybe we will find more, but only the future will tell.
Yofi, thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to speaking with you again in the near future about your progress at the Dead Sea Scrolls Lab and where you're taking the unit. So again, thank you so much. And thank you to all our viewers who joined us.
Thank you for having me.